He thought
Drop
his
the
name made him
weapon now,
untouchable.
or she
In a
dies.
quiet coastal park, a mafia boss's
I
son
can't
kicked a
do that.
veterinarian's
You're coming
dog,
with me.
then pulled a gun on the man who stepped in to protect her. What he didn't know
Get off
was
of him!
that the
Stop
calm,
it!
silent stranger standing in front of
He
him
bit me.
was a U.S.
Stay back.
Navy SEAL, a man trained for war, bonded to a K-9 who never abandons his post. One moment of cruelty turned into a chain of events that would bring down an entire criminal empire and reveal how far loyalty, courage, and love will go when innocent lives are threatened. This is not just a story about violence. It's a story about standing your ground when evil expects you to look away. If you believe justice still exists, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for stories where courage wins, loyalty never breaks, and hope rises at dawn. A gray Atlantic wind drifted through the old coastal park, carrying salt, fallen leaves, and the quiet loneliness of late afternoon. The park had stood there longer than most of the city remembered. Iron benches worn smooth by generations, stone paths cracked by time, and towering trees whose branches bent toward the sea as if listening to stories the waves refused to forget. November light filtered weakly through low clouds, turning everything the color of steel. It was the kind of place where people came to breathe, to pretend for a moment that the world beyond the trees was gentler than it truly was. She was standing near the central lawn, laughing softly as she threw a rubber ball across the grass. The woman looked to be in her late 20s, slim but not fragile, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that escaped its tie whenever the wind picked up. Her face carried the kind of kindness that came not from innocence, but from choosing gentleness again and again, despite knowing how cruel the world could be. She wore a thick olive parka, jeans smudged faintly with dirt, and sturdy boots, the uniform of someone who worked with animals, not appearances. This was Emily Carter, a veterinarian who spent her days mending broken legs, calming frightened creatures, and absorbing pain that did not belong to her. Animals trusted her instinctively. People often mistook her softness for weakness. The German Shepherd sprinting after the ball was anything but weak. The dog, Ranger, was large even for his breed, his black and tan coat glossy and dense, muscles rippling beneath his fur with every stride. At 5 years old, he moved with the confident economy of an animal that had been trained, tested, and trusted. His ears were alert, his dark eyes intelligent, always checking back to Emily even as he chased. Ranger was not just a pet. He had once been a working dog, trained under a military K-9 program before an injury ended his official service. His left hind leg bore a faint scar beneath the fur, a reminder of a mission gone wrong and a handler who never came home. Since then, Ranger had chosen Emily. Or perhaps he had decided she was someone worth guarding. "Good boy," Emily murmured as Ranger returned, dropping the ball gently at her feet, tail swaying in a controlled, measured rhythm rather than wild excitement. He never forgot his training. Sit, wait, watch. Across the park, seated on an iron bench partially hidden beneath a sycamore tree, a man observed the scene without appearing to do so. He looked like any other civilian at first glance. Dark jacket, jeans, boots worn but clean, but nothing about his posture was casual. He sat upright, shoulders squared, back straight despite the cold. His movements were minimal, deliberate, conserving energy. At 33, Daniel Cross carried the dense, compact muscle of a man who trained not for appearance, but for survival. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with arms corded from years of pull-ups, rope climbs, and carrying weight most men would drop. His hair was dark brown, cut short in a functional military style, and his skin was weathered to a light bronze by sun and salt water. His face was all sharp lines, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a thin scar slicing through one eyebrow, features carved by discipline rather than vanity. Daniel was a U.S. Navy SEAL on mandatory leave, ordered to step away after a deployment that had ended with too many names read aloud and not enough bodies brought home. Combat had taught him efficiency. Loss had taught him restraint. He spoke little to strangers, not out of arrogance, but because words felt dangerous, too easy to misuse, too hard to take back. To most people, he came across as distant, cold even. Those who knew him understood something else entirely. Daniel felt too much, and silence was the only way he kept it contained. At his feet lay another German shepherd, older than Ranger, with a thicker neck and a darker sable coat. Atlas, his canine partner, rested with his head on his paws, eyes half closed, but ears tuned to every shift of sound. At 7 years old, Atlas had spent most of his life beside Daniel, on ships, in aircraft, in places that never appeared on maps. He had been trained to track, to detect explosives, to move silently through chaos. His muzzle was graying now, but his presence radiated calm authority. Atlas trusted Daniel completely. Daniel trusted Atlas more than he trusted most humans. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly toward Emily and Ranger, then away, then back again. Old habits, scan, assess, move on. He told himself he was only watching the dog. Dogs were honest. Dogs did not pretend to be harmless while calculating how to hurt you. The sound of laughter cut through the wind, loud, sharp, invasive. Daniel's eyes narrowed. 3 men were approaching from the main path, walking with the unearned confidence of people who had never been told no. The one in front stood out immediately. He was in his late 20s, tall, lean, dressed in an expensive camel-colored coat that didn't belong in a public park. His hair was slicked back too carefully, his face smooth, untouched by real hardship. There was cruelty in his smile, the kind that came from knowing consequences did not apply to him. This was Victor Hale, son of a local crime boss, whose influence stretched from the docks to City Hall. Victor had grown up watching men step aside when his father entered a room. He had learned early that fear could replace respect if you had enough money behind it. Victor slowed when he spotted Emily. His eyes lingered on her, then on Ranger. He smirked, gesturing for his 2 companions to hang back. They were larger men, thick-necked and silent, dressed in dark coats that strained at the shoulders. They didn't smile. They didn't need to. Their job was presence. "Well, this is a sight," Victor said loudly, his voice carrying across the grass. "That's a big dog for such a small woman." Emily stiffened instantly. She had learned to recognize danger long before it announced itself. She tightened her grip on Ranger's leash and forced a polite smile. "We're leaving," she said calmly. "Have a good afternoon." Victor stepped into her path, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Expensive, overpowering. "No need to rush. I was just admiring your companion." Ranger moved between them without a sound, body angled, eyes locked on Victor. His posture was controlled, not aggressive, but unmistakably protective. Victor's smile faltered. "Control your mutt." "He's trained," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Please step back." Something dark flickered across Victor's expression. He reached out, fingers closing around Emily's sleeve, squeezing just hard enough to hurt. "Don't be rude." The moment stretched thin. Ranger reacted instantly. A low growl rolled from his chest, deep and resonant, a warning honed by years of discipline. Victor jerked his hand back, startled, then furious. Rage flooded his face, hot and irrational. "You think that thing scares me?" he snapped. Before Emily could move, Victor lashed out, his polished shoe connecting brutally with Ranger's ribs. The sound Ranger made was not a growl. It was a sharp, pained yelp that cut through the park like a blade. Time slowed. Daniel was already on his feet before his mind caught up. His body moved on instinct, muscle memory overriding thought. Atlas rose beside him, silent, lethal focus snapping into place. Daniel crossed the distance with long, efficient strides, his face empty of emotion. He stopped inches from Victor, eyes level, voice low and controlled. "Step away from them." Victor turned, taking in Daniel's size, his calm, the way Atlas stood at his side like a shadow. For a split second, uncertainty flickered. Then pride reasserted itself. Victor reached inside his coat. Metal flashed. "A gun?" Gasps rippled through the park. Daniel did not move. He had seen guns in worse hands, in darker places. He had faced death carried by men who knew how to use it. Victor Hale was not one of them. "You picked the wrong day to play hero," Victor sneered, leveling the weapon. Daniel's eyes were cold, distant, already solving the problem. "You shouldn't have touched the dog," he said, and then he stepped forward. The gun looked oversized in Victor Hale's hand, too polished, too clean, as if it had spent more time being admired than used. It trembled slightly despite his effort to appear confident, the black metal catching the dull gray light filtering through the park's bare branches. Victor stood tall, but tension stiffened his shoulders, his jaw clenched tight as embarrassment and fury battled for control inside him. He was used to fear, used to seeing it bloom instantly on people's faces when they recognized his name, his posture, his entitlement. This time, fear did not come, not from the man standing in front of him. Daniel Cross did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He did not even shift his stance. He stood squarely, feet planted shoulder-width apart on the cold stone path, weight balanced perfectly, as if the ground itself had aligned to him. Up close, Victor could see the details he had missed before, the scar slicing through Daniel's right eyebrow, pale against weathered skin, the faint stubble along his jaw, dark and even, the kind grown by men who forgot to shave because other things mattered more. The eyes, steel gray, calm to the point of indifference. These were not the eyes of a man calculating whether to survive. They were the eyes of a man deciding how much damage was necessary. Atlas stood at Daniel's left leg, unmoving, his broad head level with Victor's thigh. The older German shepherd's coat was thick and dark, flecked with gray around the muzzle, his chest wide and powerful. At 7 years old, Atlas carried himself with the composure of a veteran. His ears were forward, but his body remained still, disciplined. He did not bark. He did not growl. His restraint was more unnerving than noise ever could be. Atlas had been trained to wait for a command that might never come, and to act without hesitation when it did. Behind Daniel, Ranger lay on his side in the grass, breathing shallowly. Emily knelt beside him, one hand pressed gently to his ribs, the other shaking as she tried to steady her breath. Her face had gone pale, freckles standing out against skin drained of color, her lips parted as if words were trapped somewhere between her chest and her throat. Emily Carter had seen animals suffer. She had seen blood, broken bones, pain that could not be explained away. But seeing cruelty inflicted deliberately, casually, in front of her, it cracked something inside her. She looked up at Daniel, not with hope exactly, but with a desperate plea that said, "Please don't let this get worse." Victor sneered, trying to reclaim control. "You think you're brave?" he said loudly, glancing around at the small crowd that had begun to gather. Dog walkers frozen in place, an elderly man gripping his cane, a young couple standing rigid with fear. "You think stepping in makes you some kind of hero?" Daniel's voice was low when he answered, even measured. No. The simplicity of the response unsettled Victor more than any insult could have. "Then move!" Victor snapped. "Last warning." Daniel tilted his head a fraction, studying the angle of Victor's wrist, the placement of his fingers on the grip, the distance between them. Training clicked into place in his mind, automatic and cold. He remembered a night years ago, dust in his mouth, radio static screaming in his ear, when a man had aimed a rifle at his team with steadier hands than Victor's. He remembered the weight of bodies afterward. That memory had taken something from him, had taught him that hesitation killed faster than bullets. "You're holding it wrong," Daniel said. Victor blinked. "What?" Daniel took a slow step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, deliberate. "Your finger's too tight, you'll jerk the trigger." The crowd gasped. Someone screamed for the police. Victor's face flushed red. "I'll kill you," he spat, squeezing the grip harder, trying to force his fear into rage. Daniel moved. To an untrained eye, it happened too fast to follow. One moment Daniel was standing still. The next, he was inside Victor's space. His left hand snapped upward, striking the underside of the gun barrel with the heel of his palm, redirecting it skyward as the shot went off with a deafening crack. The bullet shattered a tree branch overhead, wood splintering down onto the path. Before Victor could react, Daniel's right hand clamped onto Victor's wrist, fingers digging deep into tendon and bone. He twisted sharply, stepping through the motion with his hips, using leverage rather than brute force. There was a wet, sickening sound, cartilage giving way. Victor screamed. The gun clattered to the ground. Daniel did not pause. He swept Victor's legs out from under him, slamming him onto his back with controlled force. Not enough to kill, but enough to leave no doubt. Victor wheezed, clutching his wrist, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Daniel knelt, one knee pressing into Victor's chest, pinning him. With his free hand, he kicked the gun out of reach and flipped it away across the pavement. Atlas shifted then, stepping forward, placing his massive body between Victor and the weapon, eyes locked, teeth bared just enough to show intent without sound. "Don't move," Daniel said quietly. Victor's two bodyguards finally reacted, surging forward. Up close, they were larger than Daniel, thick arms straining against their coats, faces rough and scarred. One had a shaved head and a crooked nose. The other wore a short beard, flecked with gray despite his age. They moved with confidence born of intimidation, not skill. Daniel looked up at them, his expression unchanged. His voice carried just far enough. "Back away." They hesitated. It was Atlas that made the difference. The older K9 lifted his head, muscles tensing, a low, controlled growl vibrating from his chest. Not a threat, but a promise. These men had hurt people before. They recognized a predator when they saw one. Sirens wailed in the distance. Emily's breath hitched as she realized she was still alive, that Ranger was still breathing, that the man kneeling over Victor had stopped something irreversible from happening. She pressed her forehead briefly to Ranger's neck, whispering nonsense words, her voice breaking. Police cruisers screeched to a halt at the edge of the park. 4 officers spilled out, weapons drawn. The first was a tall man in his late 40s with thinning blonde hair and tired eyes. His uniform stretched slightly over a soft middle. Officer Mark Sullivan had been on the force long enough to know when a situation was more complicated than it appeared. He raised a hand, signaling his younger partners to slow down. "Everyone stay where you are!" Sullivan shouted. Daniel lifted his hands slowly, deliberately, stepping back from Victor but keeping himself positioned between the fallen man and Emily. Atlas sat at his side on command alone, muscles coiled but obedient. Victor began to sob, pain and humiliation tearing through his bravado. "He attacked me!" he cried, pointing with his uninjured hand. "Arrest him!" Sullivan approached, eyes flicking from Victor's twisted wrist to the discarded gun, to the frightened crowd. Recognition crossed his face. His jaw tightened. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "are you injured?" "You see my hand?" Victor screamed. "My father will hear about this." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He had heard that tone before, in war zones run by men whose power did not come from law, but from fear. He realized then that this was not over, not by a long shot. Sullivan turned to Daniel, lowering his voice. "Sir, I need you to step away." Daniel met his gaze. He drew a gun on an unarmed woman and her dog. Sullivan swallowed. "I understand." But his eyes said something else entirely. As paramedics rushed in and Victor was lifted onto a stretcher, still screaming threats through clenched teeth, Daniel knew he had just crossed a line that could not be erased. Somewhere beyond the park, a man with real power would soon learn his son had been humiliated by a stranger who did not know his place. Daniel glanced back at Emily and Ranger, then down at Atlas. Some fights began the moment you won the first one. The police lights washed the old coastal park in alternating red and blue, colors that should have meant safety, but instead felt like a warning. The crowd thinned quickly, people retreating with heads down and phones tucked away, instinctively choosing distance over truth. Daniel Cross stood still as Victor Hale was loaded into the ambulance, the young man's face twisted with pain and hatred, his expensive coat cut open, his ruined wrist cradled like a broken promise. Even through the sirens, Victor's voice carried, hoarse and venomous, swearing that this was not over, that names would be spoken, doors would close, lives would change. Daniel did not answer. He had learned long ago that threats were not meant to be replied to, they were meant to be survived. Officer Mark Sullivan approached him again, slower this time, shoulders slightly slumped, as if the weight of the city had settled there permanently. Up close, Sullivan looked older than he had from a distance, crow's feet etched deep at the corners of his tired blue eyes, gray creeping into his thinning hair. He was tall but soft around the middle, a man who had once been strong and now carried his strength differently, buried under years of compromises. His voice dropped when he spoke, careful and almost apologetic. "You should take your dogs and leave," he said. "Tonight." Daniel studied him for a long moment, reading the unspoken truth in his posture, the way his gaze flicked instinctively toward the ambulance and then away. This was not a warning meant to assert authority. It was advice meant to keep someone alive. "Is he being charged?" Daniel asked quietly. Sullivan exhaled through his nose, a humorless sound. "There will be a report, statements, things get complicated when certain families are involved." Emily Carter heard enough to understand. She stood slowly, brushing grass from her knees, her movements careful as if sudden motion might shatter what little control she had left. Ranger lay against her leg now, breathing more evenly, though each breath still carried pain. Emily's face was pale, freckles stark against her skin, but her eyes burned with something new, anger sharpened by fear. She had believed in rules, in systems, in the idea that cruelty could be confronted and corrected. Watching the police hesitate had cracked that belief cleanly down the center. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice tight. "He pulls a gun, hurts my dog, and he just, leaves?" Sullivan met her gaze, shame flickering briefly across his face. "Ma'am," he said gently, "the best thing you can do right now is go home." Daniel placed himself subtly between Emily and the officer, not aggressively, but decisively. His tone was calm, controlled. "We're leaving." Sullivan nodded, relief mixed with resignation. "Good." They did not return to their cars. Daniel had already decided that. Vehicles were predictable, paths were traceable. Instead, he guided Emily along a side street, Atlas and Ranger flanking them, the dogs moving with quiet discipline. The walk was slow, measured to Ranger's pace, the sounds of the city muted under the weight of what had just happened. Emily hugged her arms around herself, the cold finally seeping in now that adrenaline was fading. She was aware of Daniel's presence beside her. His height, his steady stride, the way he checked reflections in darkened windows without appearing to look. He moved like a man who expected trouble, not because he wanted it, but because experience had taught him it always came. Her clinic sat on the edge of an older neighborhood, wedged between a closed bakery and a nail salon with faded pink lettering. The building itself was a converted brick house, 2 stories tall, narrow and unassuming, with a small sign above the door that read Carter Veterinary in chipped white paint. A single light glowed inside, warm and fragile against the darkness. Emily unlocked the door with trembling fingers and stepped aside to let them in. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. The waiting area was small but tidy. Wooden chairs, a low table stacked with outdated magazines, framed photos of recovered animals lining the walls. It felt safe in the way familiar places often did, not because they were truly secure, but because they held routine and care. Daniel set Ranger gently onto a padded mat near the exam table, his movements precise, practiced. Atlas lay down nearby, positioning himself where he could see both the front door and the hallway leading deeper into the building. Emily shed her coat and immediately slipped into professional focus, the shock receding as training took over. She examined Ranger's ribs, her fingers light but confident, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Bruising," she murmured, "possibly a hairline fracture. He's lucky." Her voice wavered slightly at the word lucky. She administered pain medication, her hands steady now, though her shoulders still carried tension like a coiled wire. Daniel watched in silence, his arms crossed, eyes scanning the room, noting exits, blind spots, the flimsy lock on the back door. He felt the familiar shift inside him, the one that came when civilian life peeled away and the world narrowed to threats and responsibilities. He had not chosen this, but once chosen, he would not abandon it. "You should call someone," Emily said after a moment, not looking up. "A friend? Family?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't have anyone nearby." She glanced at him then, really looked. The lines around his eyes were deeper than his age suggested, etched by sleepless nights and memories that did not fade. She wondered what it took to make a man like this, what it cost him to stand so calmly between danger and strangers. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "You've done enough." Daniel met her gaze. Not yet. Night settled heavily over the clinic. Daniel moved through the building methodically, tightening loose hinges, sliding a metal shelving unit subtly closer to the back door, checking the alley-facing window that looked out onto a narrow strip of darkness. Emily watched him from behind the counter, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in her hands. There was something strangely intimate about the sounds of quiet repair, the scrape of metal, the click of a tightened screw. This was not the violence she had witnessed earlier. This was preparation, protection made tangible. It was close to midnight when Atlas's ears lifted. He did not growl. He did not move. He simply went still in a way that made Daniel's spine straighten. Ranger stirred weakly, lifting his head, a low rumble vibrating in his chest despite the pain. Daniel reached for the light switch and stopped, leaving the room in shadow. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, the scrape of metal against wood at the rear entrance. A pause. Then another sound, heavier this time, a testing pressure. Emily's breath caught. She backed away instinctively, her heel bumping the counter. Daniel raised one finger to his lips, his other hand already guiding her silently toward the hallway. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The back door shuddered under a hard kick. Wood splintered. 3 figures pushed their way inside, moving with practiced efficiency. They wore dark clothing, faces partially obscured by knit caps pulled low. These were not drunk thugs or opportunists. These were men accustomed to violence. The one in front was tall and broad, his build thick with muscle, his beard dark and unkempt, eyes flat and predatory. This was Leon Graves, a freelance enforcer known on the docks for doing work no one else would take. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles, pale against rough skin, souvenirs from fights that had shaped him into something blunt and merciless. Behind him came 2 others, slimmer, younger, less confident, following Graves's lead without question. Graves scanned the room, lips curling into a thin smile. "Nice place," he muttered. "Boss says you should have minded your business." Daniel stepped out of the shadows. Atlas rose as one, silent and imposing at his side. Graves froze, surprise flickering across his face before hardening into recognition. "Well," he said slowly, eyes flicking to the dogs and back to Daniel, "looks like we found him." Daniel said nothing. The men advanced. The clinic exploded into motion. Atlas lunged first, a blur of muscle and controlled aggression, slamming into the second man's legs and sending him crashing to the floor. Ranger, despite his injury, surged forward with a feral bark, clamping onto the third man's sleeve and dragging him off balance. Daniel met Graves head-on, sidestepping the first swing and driving his elbow into the man's throat with brutal precision. Graves staggered, gasping, but did not fall. He grinned through the pain, swinging again. Daniel ended it with a sharp twist and a knee to the chest that sent Graves sprawling backward into a rack of supplies. Bottles shattered. Metal clanged. The fight was fast, brutal, contained. In seconds, it was over. The men scrambled, bruised and terrified, hauling each other back through the broken door, leaving blood and fear behind. Silence followed. Daniel stood in the wreckage, chest rising and falling steadily. Atlas returned to his side, alert but calm. Ranger limped back toward Emily, who had pressed herself against the wall, shaking now that the danger had passed. From the alley, a voice called out, bitter and venomous. "This was a message!" Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew then what Officer Sullivan had been trying to say. Justice had bowed, and the war had just begun. The message came just before dawn, delivered not in words but in absence. Daniel Cross woke to the low, restless movement of Atlas rising from his position near the front door, the old K9's nails clicking softly against the clinic floor. The air felt wrong, too quiet, too empty. Daniel was on his feet in an instant, bare feet silent, heart already accelerating as his eyes swept the room. Ranger's bed near the exam table was overturned. The padded blanket lay twisted and darkened with fresh blood. The back door, which Daniel had reinforced only hours earlier, stood ajar, its frame cracked, the lock ripped free with brutal force. "Emily," Daniel called once, his voice controlled but sharp. No answer. The clinic felt hollow now, the warmth drained from it. Daniel moved through the rooms with surgical speed, checking corners, the small storage closet, the hallway leading to the narrow stairs that went up to Emily's apartment. The door at the top was open. Inside, the space was wrecked. Drawers pulled out, a chair overturned, the faint smell of fear lingering like smoke. On the floor near the doorway lay Emily's phone, its screen shattered, a smear of blood across the glass. Atlas stood beside Daniel, body tense, ears flat, a low, vibrating sound rumbling deep in his chest. The dog understood loss. He had lived it. Daniel knelt briefly, touching the blood on the floor, feeling the heat still there. Fresh. Very fresh. Outside, the first light of morning crept over the coastal streets, pale and indifferent. Daniel stepped into the alley behind the clinic and stopped cold. Ranger lay there. The German shepherd's powerful body was curled awkwardly against the brick wall, his black and tan coat matted dark with blood. One eye was swollen shut, his breathing shallow and uneven. He had been struck hard, too hard to be accidental. This was deliberate, a message carved in pain. When Daniel knelt, Ranger's remaining eye fluttered open. His tail gave a faint, weak thump against the ground, followed by a low, apologetic whine that cut deeper than any blade. He had tried to protect her. He had failed. Daniel swallowed, jaw tightening until it ached. "You did your job," he murmured, his voice rough now, stripped of control. "You held the line." He worked quickly, the medic training ingrained deeper than thought. He applied pressure, checked the dog's airway, stabilized his neck. Ranger whined once more, then went still, trusting Daniel completely. Atlas hovered close, eyes scanning the alley, every muscle coiled with fury restrained by discipline. By the time Daniel carried Ranger back inside and secured him on the exam table with emergency stabilization, the rage had settled into something colder, sharper. This was no longer about standing between the weak and the cruel. This was war. Daniel found the note where they wanted him to find it, placed neatly on the front counter, weighted down with a scalpel from Emily's surgical tray. The handwriting was clean, deliberate. "Come alone, bring nothing. Dockside Warehouse 14. No signature was needed. Daniel straightened slowly, breathing through his nose, forcing calm back into his body. He checked Ranger one last time, administering sedation to ease the dog's pain. Atlas watched closely, understanding more than most humans ever would. Daniel pressed his forehead briefly to Ranger's broad skull, an intimate, wordless promise. "I'm bringing her back," he said quietly. "Both of you." He moved with purpose now, shedding the remnants of civilian life. From a hidden compartment beneath the clinic's floorboards, Daniel retrieved the items he had sworn to leave behind when he took leave. Dark tactical clothing, a compact suppressed pistol, spare magazines, zip ties, a combat knife worn smooth at the grip. He dressed in silence, his movements economical, precise. The man in the mirror was no longer a quiet stranger in a park. He was what the Navy had shaped him into after years of breaking him down and building him back sharper. Dockside Warehouse 14 sat at the edge of the harbor, a hulking concrete structure surrounded by rusted shipping containers and floodlights that burned harshly against the mist rolling in from the sea. It was a place designed to intimidate. Wide open, nowhere to hide, guards posted openly as if daring anyone to try. Victor Hale's father believed in spectacle. Fear worked better when it was seen. Emily Carter sat tied to a metal chair in a windowless room deep inside the warehouse. Her wrists were bound tightly behind her back, skin rubbed raw and bleeding. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth, pressing painfully against her lips. She had always been tall for a woman, nearly 5'9", her slender frame usually moving with quiet confidence. Now she sat hunched, shoulders trembling despite her effort to stay composed. Her chestnut hair hung loose around her face, tangled and damp with sweat. Her skin, normally warm and sun-kissed from long days outdoors, had gone pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was terrified, but not broken. Across the room stood the man responsible. Elias Vaughan, the true power behind the Hale family, watched her with detached interest. In his early 60s, Elias was tall and thin, his body narrow and rigid like a blade kept too long in its sheath. His silver hair was combed neatly back, his beard trimmed with obsessive precision. His face was angular, every line deliberate, eyes dark and empty of warmth. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and that calm had made men disappear for decades. A childhood spent in brutal poverty had carved something essential out of him. Power was the only language he trusted. "You see," Elias said conversationally, pacing slowly in front of Emily, "men like him always think they're different. That rules don't apply. That discipline makes them untouchable." He leaned closer, studying her face. "They always come." Elsewhere in the warehouse, Daniel moved unseen. He did not enter through the front. He never would. Instead, he approached from the water side, using the tide and the sound of waves crashing against pylons to mask his movement. Atlas moved ahead of him, silent as a shadow, signaling guards long before Daniel could see them. One by one, the perimeter fell, not in explosions or gunfire, but in quiet, efficient takedowns that left bodies slumped unseen in dark corners. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of catwalks, stacked crates, and echoing emptiness. Daniel moved through it like a ghost, his breathing controlled, his heart rate steady. He counted steps, timed patrols, disabled cameras with practice flicks of his knife. When guards appeared, they vanished seconds later. The final room was guarded by two men, younger, nervous. Not killers, just employees paid to look away. Daniel dropped them without breaking stride. He reached the door. Inside, Elias had just finished speaking when Daniel stepped into the light. The gun came up instantly. One of Elias's men moved to fire. Ranger appeared first. The injured German shepherd launched himself from the shadows with a roar that filled the room, his powerful jaws clamping down on the gunman's forearm mid-trigger pull. The shot went wild, shattering a light overhead. Ranger's body hit the floor hard, but he held on, teeth locked, saving Emily's life with the last of his strength. Daniel was already moving. The fight was brutal and brief. He disarmed the remaining men with precision born of countless close-quarters engagements. Elias backed away, shock finally cracking his composure. "You're making a mistake," Elias hissed. Daniel advanced, eyes cold. "You hurt my people." Elias reached for a hidden weapon. Atlas was faster. The old K9 struck with the weight of years of loyalty behind him, slamming Elias to the floor, teeth bared inches from his throat. Daniel freed Emily, cutting her restraints. She collapsed into his arms, shaking, alive. He held her only a second, long enough for her to feel the solidity of him, the promise that this nightmare was ending. Sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had finally made the call. Daniel didn't look back as he carried Emily and supported Ranger out into the night. The warehouse burned with chaos behind them, but for the first time, the balance had shifted. The mafia had made its move. The seal had answered. Morning arrived quietly, as if the city itself were holding its breath after a long night of violence. Pale sunlight crept across the harbor, turning steel-gray water into streaks, see-through gold. And for the first time in days, the air felt clean. Daniel Cross stood on the roof of the veterinary clinic, hands resting on the low brick ledge, watching the light spread. He had not slept. He did not need to. The war inside him had finally slowed, and in that stillness, something unfamiliar settled. Relief, edged with exhaustion. Below him, federal vehicles filled the street, black SUVs with tinted windows, unmarked vans, men and women in dark jackets moved with purpose, voices low, radios murmuring. This was not the local police who had hesitated in the park. This was a different kind of authority. Quiet, relentless, immune to intimidation. The evidence Daniel had recovered, combined with what the agents found in Dockside Warehouse 14, had been enough. Enough to crack a network that had believed itself untouchable for decades. Inside the clinic, Emily Carter sat on the edge of the exam table, wrapped in a gray blanket one of the agents had brought her. She looked smaller than she had days ago, not because she had lost strength, but because fear had finally been allowed to leave her body. Her chestnut hair was pulled back loosely, strands falling around her face, her skin still pale but warming slowly with color. The bruises on her wrists were ugly, purple and yellow marks circling her slender arms, but she held them without shame. They were proof she had survived. A woman stepped toward her, holding a clipboard. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair cut in a practical shoulder-length style. Her eyes were alert but kind, the eyes of someone who had seen too much and chosen to keep caring anyway. This was Agent Laura Mitchell, a federal investigator specializing in organized crime. Her posture was straight, her movements efficient, but her voice was gentle when she spoke. "You're safe now," she said. "Both of you are." Emily nodded, swallowing hard. "They're really gone?" Mitchell's lips curved into a small professional smile. "Elias Vaughan, Victor Hale, their entire operation. Assets frozen, arrests made. There will be trials, long ones." Emily closed her eyes for a second, letting the words sink in. Justice, real justice, felt strange, heavy, almost unreal. Across the room, Ranger lay on a thick recovery bed, his body wrapped in fresh bandages. The German shepherd's breathing was steady now, deep and even. His once glossy coat bore shaved patches and scars, jagged reminders of violence endured, but his eyes, when they opened, were bright. He was 6 years old now, his muzzle darkening with faint threads of gray that would one day be more noticeable. When he saw Emily, his tail thumped weakly against the padding, determination shining through pain. He would heal. He always did. Atlas lay nearby, his older body stretched out but alert, watching everything with calm vigilance. At 8 years old, his movements were slower than they once had been, his joints stiff in the mornings, but his presence still radiated authority. He had done his duty one last time, and he knew it. Dogs like Atlas measured life not in years, but in loyalty given and returned. Daniel came down from the roof quietly, stepping into the clinic just as Agent Mitchell finished her notes. The morning light framed him in the doorway, outlining the broad lines of his shoulders, the lean strength in his arms. His face was marked by fatigue now, dark shadows beneath his eyes, stubble rough along his jaw. But there was something softer there, too, something unguarded. He had survived firefights and ambushes without flinching. But standing here, watching Emily breathe freely, watching Ranger rest, felt more dangerous than any battlefield. Because it mattered. Mitchell studied him openly, assessing. "You're the one who brought us the break," she said. "You could have walked away." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I didn't." She nodded, accepting that answer without pressing. "The Bureau will handle the rest. Your name won't appear in the reports unless you want it to." "I don't," Daniel said immediately. Mitchell's expression suggested she had expected nothing else. Good. She paused, then added more softly. You did a lot of good here. When the agents finally left, the clinic felt strangely empty. The noise, the tension, the sense of looming threat, all of it faded, leaving behind quiet and sunlight and the hum of a refrigerator. Emily moved slowly around the room, tidying without really noticing what she was doing. Normal tasks felt foreign after chaos. Daniel helped without being asked, righting a chair, sweeping broken glass from the night before. The simplicity of the actions grounded him. For years, his life had been defined by missions with clear objectives and clear endings. This felt different, messier, more human. Ranger stirred as Daniel approached, lifting his head. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's broad chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. You scared me, he murmured. Ranger huffed softly, as if to say worth it. Emily watched them, something tight loosening in her chest. She had seen Daniel as a shield, a force, a soldier. Now she saw the gentleness in the way his hand moved, the care in his touch. He's going to have scars, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. So do I. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Emily met his eyes then, really met them, and saw not a weapon, but a man who had been shaped by violence and still chosen protection. Thank you, she said, for everything. Daniel looked away first, uncomfortable with gratitude. I did what needed doing. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but full. Outside, a breeze rustled the trees lining the street, leaves whispering against one another like applause. By late afternoon, Ranger was able to stand with assistance. His steps were slow and uneven, but determined. Emily laughed through tears as he leaned against her, tail wagging with effort. Atlas watched from his spot by the door, eyes half-lidded, content. Daniel's phone buzzed then, a sound that pulled him abruptly back to another life. He checked the message once, jaw tightening. Orders. His leave was over. The world was calling him back to places without names. Emily noticed the change immediately. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. I have to report back tomorrow. Her shoulders dipped slightly, disappointment flickering across her face before she masked it. She straightened, forcing a smile. Of course, that makes sense. He hesitated, words lining up and falling apart in his mind. He had always been good at leaving. This time felt different. I don't usually make promises, he said finally, but I'll come back when this is done. Emily studied him, searching for certainty. She found it not in his words, but in his posture, his eyes. I'll be here, she said. We will. Atlas rose slowly and walked over, pressing his head against Daniel's leg, a familiar, grounding weight. Ranger let out a low, approving sound, as if seconding the vow. The next morning, the city looked different, brighter, as if some invisible pressure had lifted. Daniel loaded his bag into the trunk of a rental car parked across the street. He moved with the same discipline he always had, but there was no urgency now. Emily stood on the sidewalk with Ranger, one hand resting on the dog's back, the other tucked into her pocket to hide its trembling. Daniel knelt one last time, resting his forehead briefly against Ranger's. Heal up, he said. You're needed here. Ranger licked his face, slow and deliberate. Daniel stood facing Emily. She was tall, slender, stronger than she had ever believed herself to be. Her skin glowed in the morning light, freckles catching the sun, her eyes clear and steady. She did not look like someone waiting to be saved anymore. She looked like someone who had survived. Be careful, she said. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. I always am. He leaned forward and pressed a brief kiss to her forehead. Nothing dramatic, nothing demanding, just a promise made in silence. Then he turned and walked to the car. As he drove away, Daniel glanced once in the rearview mirror. Emily stood with Ranger beside her, Atlas sitting proudly at her feet, all three of them framed by sunlight. He did not feel like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was moving toward something. The road stretched ahead, open and uncertain. For the first time in years, Daniel Cross was not running toward danger. He was going home. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes, they arrive as a man who chooses to stand still when fear tells him to run. Sometimes, they arrive as a wounded dog who rises anyway, not because he is strong, but because love demands it. And sometimes, they arrive as a woman who discovers that courage was already living inside her, waiting for the moment it was needed. In everyday life, we may never face guns or mafias or battles in the dark, but we face quieter wars every day. The choice to protect instead of ignore, to speak instead of stay silent, to be kind when the world rewards cruelty, to hold the line when walking away would be easier. The miracle is not that evil falls. The miracle is that good people still stand. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that your presence matters more than you realize. Someone somewhere may be waiting for the moment you choose courage. Please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what part of the story moved you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories of courage, loyalty, and light in dark places. Before you go, let us say a prayer for you. May God place a shield of protection around you and those you love. May He give you the strength to stand when the moment calls for bravery, the wisdom to choose kindness in a harsh world, and the peace that quiets fear when the night feels long. May He guide your steps, guard your heart, and remind you that you are never truly alone. If you receive this prayer, write Amen in the comments. God bless you and stay safe.